When you think of a typical high school history class, what is the first thing that comes to mind? Lots of reading homework, dense textbook sections, and that is exactly where our problem lies in teaching American history in schools. Since the beginning of America, the primary method of teaching history has been textbooks. Dense, thick textbooks from which students are assigned reading homework. Students, for their part, are told to believe what they read as factual. Now, don't get me wrong. The information in textbooks is factual, for the most part. We'll get into that later. The more pressing problem, however, is the information that is omitted in textbooks. The information that is intentionally not included and hid from young students like us. Now, you may ask why. Why are people going through so much trouble to hide aspects of history from young, innocent students like us? What is so confidential about these aspects of history? The answer is a complex one. Now, before we can begin to talk about why history is hidden from us, first and foremost, we need to discuss what aspects of history are hidden from us. Sometimes this answer is glaringly obvious. For example, the complete absence of words like race and racism in our textbooks. James Loewen was a historian who analyzed over a dozen high school history textbooks and found only 5 of them to list race, racism, or anything of the like in their indexes. Now think of a time when you've done something wrong. What is the first thing that comes to your mind? Don't tell anyone. Because if you don't tell anyone, then you don't have to be embarrassed about what you did wrong. America is the same way, just on a much larger scale. Racism is one of the worst aspects about American history. And so what is the natural thing to do next? Try and hide it. Hide minority groups' horrific experiences in American history, and instead try and paint a more picture-perfect version of our country. Now, this is one of the more obvious examples of the bias in these textbooks. But far more dangerous than this are the more subtle examples of the bias. Omission of information is not the only thing that's wrong in these textbooks. There's also a problem with the way information is presented. Negative things in American history are presented in such a way that make those things look not as bad. Take, for example, a McGraw-Hill history textbook, which said that the Atlantic slave trade brought millions of African-American workers to the southern United States to work on agricultural plantations. Now, is it immediately obvious to you guys what was wrong with this sentence? At first, it wasn't to me either, but listen closely and you'll hear it. The Atlantic slave trade brought millions of African-American workers, when in fact, these people weren't workers, they were slaves, inhumanely treated slaves. Being a worker isn't nearly as bad as being a slave. In fact, being a worker isn't bad at all. So, when the textbook inaccurately characterizes these people as workers, students think that the situation was better than it actually was. And thus, one of the worst aspects of American history is effectively downplayed. This type of textbook bias was first brought to my attention last year when I was a junior in my AP English Language and Composition class. For homework, we had to read a New York Times article which discussed the process of state governments reviewing, editing, and then approving textbooks for classroom use. The article discussed how state governments' political affiliations could cause one single issue or one single event to be portrayed in 2 completely separate ways. This article helped me realize the tremendous impact of our government on our education and the implications of it on the future of our society. The impacts of this are more severe than many of us think. On the surface level, this type of textbook bias erases a fundamental aspect of American history, the history of African-American racism, slavery, and white supremacy. It invalidates African-Americans' immense contributions to our country. Let's go a bit deeper though. What is the impact of this bias on students like us who are reading the biased information? The impact is that we begin to develop the bias ourselves. You see, today in America, there are no formal racist laws like there used to be in the past. However, the effects of these past laws are still felt throughout our country. In order for us to be able to understand this present-day racism, first and foremost, we need to understand the history behind the laws that caused them. However, this history is not being properly taught to us, so it is really difficult for us to even understand the racism, let alone try and fight it. Instead, we begin to develop the bias ourselves. We have also been taught this type of bias from a very young age. And as we get older, it becomes harder and harder for us to get rid of this bias. Youth is also the future of America. Students like us are the people that will eventually go into roles like law enforcement or government officials or teachers or parents. Even if we don't go into any of these roles, we will probably still be exercising our right to vote. And that is when our implicit bias will begin to show itself in the form of racism. So, by introducing bias in the present, these textbooks essentially allow systemic racism to continue on in the future. So, we have a problem, a big one. But how do we go about solving it? Well, one method would be to use primary sources as learning material instead of textbooks. Primary sources would offer an original and unaltered view of history from the people that lived through the history themselves. However, even with primary sources, it would be important to represent all perspectives of the issue, as not doing so could result in an incomplete view of the issue for students, which should still lead to bias. But that's a more fundamental solution. What are some small things that students like us can do to protect ourselves? Well, for one thing, we can pay more attention to what we are being taught and the implications of it in our future. We need to keep our eyes out for people that may be trying to sway our opinions. We need to do our own research on issues instead of blindly believing what we are taught in school. And this is important not only just in school, but also as we transition into adulthood. Last month, I turned 18, and I now have the right to vote in this country. For my part, I'm staying updated on current events and doing thorough research on issues so I can understand all perspectives, instead of only the perspective that I am presented with. It is these small actions that every individual must take to become the fundamental force of change in our society. We are the future of our country, yet also the most vulnerable to any sort of manipulation. We must raise our voices to protect ourselves from any sort of bias. We want an equitable society for all. So as we transition into adulthood, let's become more responsible citizens and change our society for the better. Thank you.